ladies and gentlemen. No worries. Yes, and when the beautiful megastar from Melbourne, Australia, steps athwart these boards, I want you all to give her the clap she so richly deserves. I want you to put your hands together very warmly on her opening, if you will.
No, please. What's funny about that? You'd laugh at anything, wouldn't you? Oh, thank goodness.
We got a great lineup of talent. First cab off the rank tonight is Barry Humphries in an artistic cameo. Barry isn't a poofter, but he gives a pretty good impression of one.
I always knew I was an artist of some kind. Perhaps a writer or a painter, and yet my efforts at painting have not been successful. I'm just a cheerful amateur with a style somewhere between Winston Churchill and Hitler, you know, with a bit of Noel Coward thrown in. There's nothing somehow sadder or dangerous when you think that Hitler's great aim was to be an artist. The disappointed artist is very often a most unsatisfactory, neurotic.
I think the frustrated artist is, well, sometimes a very, very dangerous person in the community. I don't know where I got that idea. I could have picked it up from him.
Yes.
Sometimes, you know, I do.
Barry Humphries came here to London in 1959 and his career took off quite soon after that. He'd made a name for himself in Melbourne in Australia, which he affected to think of as the dullest place on the planet, but it gave him his material. Even though he was a square peg in a round hole, even though he wanted to be away from Melbourne to what he saw as the cultured, sophisticated city and idea-laden place of England. So he came here with the embryonic Edna, who was to become his great character. He went to the Establishment Club, for instance, a couple of streets away from where we're filming now, which was set up by Peter Cook, already a young doyen of satire, Beyond the Fringe, and so on. But he didn't fit in there. He didn't like doing political stuff, and that's what they specialised in over at the Establishment. And it wasn't that gang, that satirical gang, that was that Beyond the Fringe, that was a week that was gang, that took him over. It was John Betjeman, the poet. And it chimed with a lot of Betjeman's work, what he was saying, the way he was doing it. That satire, which was gentle and social observation and based on faint caricature, but quite friendly in that way. And Betjeman took him up. He took him to Oxford, for instance, where he met Maurice Bower, the Warden of Woodham, and many of the scholars in All Souls. And Barry Humphries flowered in that environment. He made good contacts and interesting contacts with the sort of people he thought all England was like, in a way. Or he said he thought all England was like, in a way.
My father was a successful builder. I wasn't interested in that. And I'd sit there in my parents' sitting room playing English music, generally music by Vaughan Williams or Delius, imagining what it would be like to be in England, and rather wishing I were there and not stuck in a Melbourne suburb. And I felt, in a sense, frustrated by the philistinism of that kind of life.
But did you have a sense in which, in order to get out of that, you had to invent yourself?
Yes.
And how did... Can you remember now how you set about that, if you did set about it, or did it just gradually occur?
I felt I wanted to be an artist of some kind because I was an amateur painter, and I still am. But I didn't want to say that because that would bring a great deal of anger. That would produce a great deal of anger and disappointment in my parents. So I began to feel that the things I was good at were things I couldn't talk about. So I had to invent a character for myself.
You toured the state of Victoria with a rep company, as I understand. And it was during that period that you started to create your own characters.
Yes.
Can you just describe that a little bit? So I'm trying to be very interested to get in at the start of all this.
It was a chance I'd waited for. I could escape from the university into some other fill-in job until I made up my mind what I was really going to do. Breaking the news to my parents was difficult. It was Orsino in Twelfth Night, the most unlikely bit of casting.
You had that wonderful line, hadn't you?
If music be the food of love, play on. It's a very good line, but somehow I got a laugh on it. I think it had something to do with my tights. Somehow the tights were too big. They were baggy around the knees. I tried to stand behind the furniture.
But I'll say this for Barry. There is a talent there. I'd love to see him in Ibsen or Strindberg or something like that. I think he'd be good if people didn't giggle, because there's something a little bit ridiculous about him.
After each performance, there would be a little supper given in the church hall for the actors, consisting of delicious cakes, lamingtons, have you heard of them? They're Australian cakes. Pavlovas and vanilla slices, and we'd all sit there and eat these cakes politely, and the Lady Mayoress would make a speech about culture, how grateful she was to us all, and how we'd brought this beautiful play by Shakespeare, this wonderful poet, to Wagga Wagga, or wherever it might have been. So I impersonated the Lady Mayoress. I did her voice, and I more or less repeated exactly what she said. Wasn't all that joking, and everyone was vastly amused by this character, and so it was a running gag in the bus trips. And only at the end of the season did Ray Lawler, who was our resident director, say, "Barry, why don't you, what's that character's name?" I said, "Edna." I said Edna because I'd once had a sort of nanny called Edna, whom I liked very much. And they said, well, he said, "What's her other name?" I said, "Oh." I said, "I haven't thought." I said, "She's a very average sort of a person, so I'll call her Edna Everage." And he said, "Why don't you write a sketch about her?" He said, "We'll put it in the review, the Christmas review." I said, "Who would play her?" I said, "Could Zoe, one of the girls, play her? I'll do the voice in the wings." He said, "Oh, no, you do it." He said, "Do it like a pantomime dame." So I said, "All right."
People see me on the TV, they think that it's Barry dressed up as me, and that's a compliment in a way to him, to think that he could impersonate a real person. But there are some people, sick people, who say that I'm Barry Humphries dressed up. What an unsavoury thing that is. And surely, anyway, if I'd been a man, my gynecologist would have mentioned it by now. Don't you think?
Now, you've said also that, just to dig around a bit more, that your character as an actor was largely born from a great anger with the parochialism of suburban Australia during your childhood.
I was shaking a fist at the rather nice, cosy institutions, at the politics of niceness, if you like, which had ruled my youth. And now I was assaulting niceness in another way. I was depicting a very nice woman. There was no question that Edna was anything other than nice.
Humphries arrived in England in 1959 and worked as a jobbing actor in productions such as Oliver. Despite his success in Australia, in England his humorous monologues were only available on record. It was 1963 when Edna got her first booking at the Establishment Club, thanks to Peter Cook.
Peter Cook had thought I was funny from these gramophone records. But I didn't feel funny on the stage of the Establishment, looking down at this audience who were expecting jokes about Harold Macmillan. And when a comedian doesn't feel funny, he isn't funny. You've got to feel funny.
Barry had very few fans in those days, but Peter was one of them.
John Betjeman was another.
Betjeman was another, but they were few and far between. And of course people don't remember that Dame Edna in her first appearance wasn't Dame at all. She was a very sort of drab little Australian housewife with a handbag on her knee. I always thought it was, well, somebody said it was like, when he turned into Dame Edna, it was like a great butterfly coming out of this really grubby little caterpillar, which was quite apt, really.
I remember Osbert Lancaster. I met him at a party of Morris Bowers at Oxford. And for want of anything to say, Osbert said, "Oh, you're Australian, are you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, God, save us from some of your countrymen." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, my friend Betjeman sent me to this terrible club in London." He said, "I think it was a brothel of some kind." And he said, "There was this terrible drag queen there, dressed as a woman." He said, "It was the most excruciatingly boring evening I've ever spent. Well, I knew who he meant, and he was in too deep, you know. I couldn't say, I'm afraid it was me. I said, yes, I saw that too. It was awful, wasn't it? I said, we're not all like that.
Despite the initial failure of the character Edna Everage, Peter Cook still had faith in Barry Humphries. He teamed him up with the illustrator Nicholas Garland to create a cartoon strip about an Australian in Earl's Court for the magazine Private Eye.
Garland drew him lantern-jawed and rather tall. The English were always drawn as snivelling starvelings, in rags, begging, rapacious, dishonest. And into that I could put my vast collection of Australian slang, some of it real, some invented.
That's what I was coming to, because one of the things that we all used to do is to go around saying these words to each other.
I invented an Australianese, a way of speaking which no Australian employed, which gave the impression of Australian speech. And that's what became a cult in London, I think. I think that's why people enjoyed Barry Mackenzie, because he spoke in this extraordinary, elaborate, rather artificial way.
But it was interesting, as I understand it, that some of the words you invented, as it were, went back into the language.
It's difficult for me now to think what I invented and what I didn't. I think pointing Percy at the porcelain was mine. And there were a number of variations, like aiming Archie at the Armitage. You know, all the various names that one reads on lavatories when one's having a pee, you know. Mackenzie went to the lavatory a lot. He was, in fact, incontinent.
I think the Barry Mackenzie strip was the first Private Eye feature which had real major appeal and really actually affected the magazine's sales. It was a fantastic success. And of course, I mean, like any successful strip, it led on from issue to issue. It did us the power of good. I think the word chundo, which he introduced, might have been an authentic Australian word. But apart from that, the rest of it was all made up. So he created a kind of image of Australians with, I mean, the corks on the hats and all these sort of weird expressions about shaking hands with the wife's best friend. That came to be regarded as what Australians were like. So I don't think he did his own country a great service at all.
I think British audiences responded very warmly to the character of Barry Mackenzie. As indeed British audiences respond very warmly to anything that is funny. You know, the British audience is a wonderful comedy audience. But Edna was the character that continued, that had the longer life, largely because my livelihood was dependent on it. And I was Edna.
I'm awfully sorry that Barry Humphries couldn't be here this evening, but we've just flown in from Australia and we're both suffering from jet lag, I'm afraid.
How is it showing itself, your suffering?
Well, I'm feeling very, very well, but Barry isn't terribly well. Poor Pet. He's back in the hotel, and of course, he has just had a vasectomy on his diners card. He's not 100%.
I did a Russell Harty show. And that was the first time Edna really was funny. You know, she'd made appearances in British satire shows during the 60s, experimental ones, but hadn't quite taken off. But now she did.
How do you do? My name is Edna Everage, housewife superstar.
It wasn't very long after that that Michael White approached me and suggested a West End season. And I did the show I'd just been doing in Australia, with very little changed, and that was Housewife Superstar. And that was a big hit. And I just keep on doing it now.
Despite her introduction to a wide new audience through television, the backbone of Edna's success has always been her stage shows. Her most recent show started with her in Widow's Weeds after the death of her bedridden husband, Norman.
She'll begin by talking about the death of her husband and how the psychiatrist, who she sees for her son, not for herself, the psychiatrist says, time will heal. Don't grieve about your husband. Time will heal. And Edna said, you know, it has, because he died, what, 4 hours ago, and already I'm feeling wonderful.
We filmed his last moments on Super 8, praying deep down he'd recuperate. At least now they can't bump up his booper rate. And I can't let my public die. Thank you, Papa.
You've written, or I've read it in interviews, about your feeling of power on the stage. What are the parameters of this power?
They're limitless.
Really?
The audience wish you to exert a maximum degree of power over them. They deliver themselves into your hands. They know they're not going to be hurt. They're titillated by the possibility they might be. The ripple of fear when Edna looks into their midst to select a victim is a pleasurable ripple, you know. What's going to happen, you know? It's almost, it has a certain eroticism about it.
Hello, Anne, you darling. Look at your little poem in beige. Hello, Senior. Isn't he in a wonderful state of preservation, too? He's not going to need much encouragement to go with this glamour puss, is he, Anne? I think he's having a hormonal resurgence in the mental pack.
She says, I really like you very much, and the audience knows she does. So finally, embarrassment becomes a benediction bestowed upon these people, generally women of a certain age, at Edna's age. They have the blessing of this vulture disguised as a bird of paradise, and they become stars themselves.
He did inhabit Edna in a way. He became her. Now, lots of people say that, but he became her in an almost creepy way sometimes. And we see that on the film. And then you begin to wonder, is the real Barry Humphries as real as we are pretending he is? Because he actually made himself look a little grander, a little than he was when the camera was off. So it had lots of resonances, ambiguities. We enjoyed doing it. I think it says a lot about somebody who becomes obsessed by the character they create to the extent that the character they create, in a way, takes them over.
Darling, I don't think he knows who he is anymore. Does that sound a cliche? Does that sound a little facile? Perhaps it does, viewers. But I wonder if, when Barry Humphries looks in the mirror in the mornings, what does he see there?
I've always, in a sense, been more interested in collecting things than doing things. I think it may be a desire to vicariously participate in the creation of that thing, to track down the works of one particular artist, to become obsessively interested in that artist's life, to find his rarest creations, and then to attempt to acquire them.
To a certain extent, talking about Edna would seem a long remove from someone who has a considered and detailed interest in late 19th century, has a collection of paintings about that, is an aesthete, collects books. It is, on the surface, a quite strong difference between what you are there and what goes on the stage. Now, do you think that's just on the surface?
No, I don't think anything is just on the surface, really at all.
He's changed a lot, of course, over the years.
And I don't see a big connection between what I do in the theatre and what privately I'm enthusiastic about. I don't see it, but I'm aware that it has to, somewhere, in a submerged sense, exist.
Might it be something to do with power? Might it be to do with possession, possessing the whole of this person's?
Yes, I think it is possibly, too, an exercise of, albeit a harmless exercise of power.
Having said that, do you see any connection between that and Edna and Les?
No, I don't, though you seem to be putting the words into my mouth.
No,
I mean,
just pursuing a line.
No, I don't. It
Well,
may
that's
be
all right.
that... But that doesn't mean that there isn't a connection. It may be that I don't wish to see it. I mean, if you are suggesting that the kind of collecting that I do is to some extent an exercise of power over the oeuvre of an artist.
Just a thought.
Yeah, I know, it's an interesting one, and I think to some extent true. Then, to what extent is it important that I should possess my audiences, that I should dominate them and exercise my power? What satisfaction do I get? Well, perhaps it is my way, as I hoped to have expressed earlier, of showing my love for people, for my audiences, for life itself, or for the gifts that I've been given, as unselfconscious.